On my 18th birthday, I expected the usual things: a cake with too many candles, a handful of text messages from people I barely remembered to call me on schedule, a few jokes about finally being legal. Instead, late that night after everyone had left and the apartment smelled faintly of melted frosting, my father asked me to step into the kitchen with him and close the door behind us. There was a moment, just a breath, where the light from the hallway made the little groove in the kitchen counter look like a line on a map. He didn't fumble for a speech about how proud he was, or for the rehearsed dad lines I'd heard at other parties. His hands were bare, no flourish, and his voice came low and steady, like someone reading aloud from a page they'd marked a long time ago. "I need to tell you things I never said before," he began. "Not because I think you don't know pieces of it, but because you deserve the rest." I sat on a worn stool, the cushion dented where my sister June used to perch when she visited, and listened. The cake sat on the table behind me, a single candle wick still smoldering. Outside, rain hit the window in quick, indifferent taps, an echo of a different night that would take shake in his words. If you're into stories like this, consider subscribing, and tell us in the comments one moment that changed your life. He started at the beginning, though he didn't call it that. He used the word night as a way in, the rain as a frame. He described a gas station under sodium lights where everything looked blunted, as if the world had been taken out of color. "It was raining," he said. "You were small. She left you by the pump. I remember the sound of the tires, the way her coat stuck to the seat when she opened the door." He didn't traumatize it. There was no raised voice, no cliff of accusation. He said it plainly, like a fact, but the way his jaw tightened at the corners let me know the pain was still precise. I had pieces of that night in my head already, small, sharp things, the cracked screen of an old phone my father kept in a drawer because it held a message that haunted him, a faded grocery store receipt from the week after that he'd tucked inside a cookbook, a photograph of me asleep at 8 months old, my tiny fist curled around the edge of a blankie. But I had never had him put all the pieces together with his own mouth. "He sent a text," he told me. He didn't say who he was. Some names in the story didn't need repeating. The absence of specific detail made certain moments louder. A man's name. It said, "It's your problem now." The image hit me harder than the rest. A cracked screen lit in the dark, a single sentence that collapsed a life into responsibility. My head filled with the small mechanics of it, the way a phone vibrates in the dark, the reflection of a stoplight on glass, and I realized I'd always known the shape of that phrase, like a notch in a fence I'd learned to step around. After that night, the world folded differently. He painted the next years in work rhythms, nights spent on the kitchen table filling out forms until his fingers ached, early mornings where both he and I shared a single mug of coffee because there wasn't time for anything elaborate. He learned things that aren't taught in books: how to soothe a fever at 3 a.m., how to braid a small child's hair without waking them, how to answer a teacher's concerned email with calm that felt thinner than the paper it was written on. "I watched a lot of parenting videos," he admitted, with a self-conscious laugh that stopped itself. "Stupidly specific things: which way to hold you when you wanted to burp, how to make your hair not tangle, how to say no without breaking us." There were practicalities: the grandmother, Linda, who took shifts sleeping on our couch to give him a few hours of rest; June, who would bring over lasagna and then sit quietly while he read bills aloud. There were things more humiliating and more human: the nights he stood outside the apartment, phone in hand, staring at the screen because there were deadlines and rent and a child who needed clean socks. The stories were ordinary in their difficulty and extraordinary in the way he told them, because he layered in small acts, the way he carried a bag of groceries and a diaper bag at the same time for 5 city blocks until a neighbor helped, the way he learned to braid my hair by watching 3-minute clips on a cheap laptop perched on the sink. I thought of all those quiet domestic feats as acts of defiance, living despite everything. He made them sound like survival strategies, not heroics. "I wanted to keep it normal for you," he said, "not because there wasn't chaos, but because the chaos was mine. Your part of the house should have been simple." It was during those years that he made a practice out of preservation. He became meticulous in ways that felt almost absurd, saving every message, every bill, every scrap that could prove we had tried and been denied and fought for. He kept a folder, an actual ring binder with dividers labeled in his childish handwriting, receipts, call logs, messages, witnesses. The folder hardly seemed material enough for the weighted bore. When he talked about it, his pride shone in the same place where his exhaustion sat. There was strategy here, careful, ordinary, relentless legalism of the kind that comes from protecting someone instead of mourning what was lost. We started pretending paperwork could be a shield, he said, and in a way it became one. He told me about Patricia Wong, the family lawyer they found after months of false starts. She had papered 30 cases before she met us, he said, smiling faintly at the memory. Sharp, efficient. She made it clear where the weak spots were and where the law would listen. Patricia was the one who told him to collect the text messages, to note every missed date, every unreturned phone call.
She advised him on how to keep emotional distance in court, how to present facts without being swallowed by grief. It was in the overhead of a courtroom corridor that he described the worst of it. The formalities, the chairs that squeaked when you sat down, the smell of coffee and old paper. Judge Marion Foster appeared in his story like a necessary instrument, more a voice than a person. She asked questions that were not unkind, but were unwavering. She asked if the environment was safe for you, he said. She looked at the documents, the folder we brought. Patricia laid it out. She asked about support, about presence, about every small thing that makes a life stable for a child. He did not dramatize the judge's ruling. He told it with the grateful reserve of someone who had finally reached shore after nights staring at a storm. The court concluded what the paperwork suggested. The other parent's rights were formally ended. She signed the papers that remade us, he said. It was more relief than anything. Not triumph, just a kind of breathing permission. It was odd to hear him say it aloud, an adult on my 18th birthday recounting the day the state clarified our family line. I remembered the courthouse days in fragments, a plastic cup of bad coffee, a woman with sharp glasses, my small hand curled inside his as we sat on a waiting room chair that smelled faintly of disinfectant. But I had never felt the word relief the way he did then. The legal end of something didn't erase the nights or wash away the absence, but it had given him a tool he could use to decide what kind of life I would live. Documentation saved us, he said, tapping the ring of his wedding band with a nervous thumb, an old habit he had whenever he returned to a memory he hadn't yet reconciled. Not because laws are perfect, but because when you're facing someone who can use you to hurt another person, paper can be a fence. He used the word fence, and I thought of the small metal gate at the community garden where I used to play when I was 5, the simple swing hung from a beam that creaked if more than one child jumped on it. He was building a fence around my childhood, not to hide me from the world, but to keep me from becoming a pawn. There were other things that had happened in the years after the ruling, things I'd only caught in whispers. Once, he told me, the mother, Vanessa, returned in fits and starts, as if trying to test whether a house still remembered how to hold her. She showed up to a park with a coffee in hand, sat on the other side of the bench while I kicked a stone. She attempted to speak to me, words muddled by time. There were supervised visits, mediations that felt rehearsed, attempts to rebuild something that didn't match the shape of what had been broken. At first, I let you see her in controlled ways, he said. I wanted to give you space to decide, not because I thought you owed her anything, but because you deserved the chance to make that choice. Those supervised meetings didn't stitch anything together. There were moments that looked like they might become meaningful, Vanessa bringing a stuffed animal once, kneeling awkwardly at my level, but the meetings were unstable. Her presence felt like a gust more than a shelter. He told me about a hospital trip later, about the way a small crisis rearranged priorities. She wound up in the hospital one winter, he said carefully, as if testing the waters of the memory. I went because there were still things tied up in papers and names. I went because certain people needed to know others weren't disappearing. You weren't there. We kept you away. It was strange to be on that side of things. He didn't offer diagnosis or blame. He noted it as an event, significant because it came after attempts at reconnection. Later, he mentioned a letter, an apology that arrived months after the hospital visit, folded and tentative. He kept it in the ring binder, too, in a sleeve labeled correspondence. It said she was sorry, he told me. It said she hoped I was doing okay. I felt a complex flare of things when he said that. Because apology is both a balm and a confession. It acknowledges harm, but does not always repair it. He himself had not erased the boundaries he'd set. The letter was one object among many, a piece of paper that acknowledged pain without dissolving the reasons for keeping distance. When he spoke of the fraud episode, Richard Delroy's name came out of him like a bad taste in his mouth. His voice hardened briefly. Someone had tried to exploit our identities, to take advantage of the system the way predators exploit any gap in a fence. There were people who thought our story could be a currency, he said. They tried to use names to get access. I had to be one step ahead. He described phone calls at odd hours, forged documents, threats that never became crimes because he had the papers ready, because the folder held his life in microfiche. He told me about nights he'd stayed awake piecing together the story like a map, receipts, messages, witness statements. The folder became not nostalgic memorabilia, but a living thing, active defense. The paperwork was a ledger of presence, he said. Every bill we paid on time, every pediatrician visit, every time you made it to school despite me working a graveyard shift. The honesty of his voice made me feel both small and enormous. Small because I had been the center of a labor I'd only glimpsed. Enormous because hearing it all out loud asserted me as a person with a history, not a blank upon which other people's choices were written. He paused then, and the pause held a shape I recognized from other conversations. That awful sudden gravity, when someone prepares to make a confession that isn't just factual but moral.
I waited, tracing with my thumb the ring left by the candle stubble on the table. The kitchen hummed faintly with the refrigerator's cooling, a background pulse to his next words. I didn't tell you everything at the time, he said. I made choices about what you would know. But that doesn't mean I was hiding from you, only from what might use you without asking. He looked at me then, full on, and for a second I saw a man who had been less a stern parental presence than a container for worry. He had sleepless lines at his eyes I hadn't registered before, and a softness in his mouth I had seen when he smiled at photographs I took as a teenager. There were details I kept back because I thought knowing them would hurt you more than help, he continued, because some facts become instruments in other people's hands. I wanted the instrument broken. I thought back to the times I tried to make sense of the gap in my life, the questions that had lived in me, the angry, curious twinges that had made me eavesdrop on adult conversations, the way I'd sometimes stay up late scrolling through old photos. The confession was not a revelation of new events. It was an authorization to feel things I hadn't allowed myself to name. Abandonment, yes, but also relentless caretaking and deliberate protection. He admitted mistakes too, which mattered more than the facts. I could have told you sooner some ways, he said. There were times I used silence because it was easier. There were nights I let bitterness shape my words in ways I later regretted. I am sorry for how that landed on you. When he said those last 3 words, I felt the room tilt. Apology is not the erasure I'd mentioned earlier, but it was still a bridge. The vulnerability in his voice was a kind of risk, and it reminded me that admission can be an offering when it is not asked for. He explained that one reason he'd waited until I was 18 was not just a legal threshold, but a moral one. You could decide for yourself, he said. You could decide how to carry it. I didn't want those decisions made for you. I wanted you to have the right to choose how to use the facts in your own life. It made sense in a way that was both tender and difficult. He'd protected my autonomy by withholding certain stories until the day I could hold them without being told what to do with them. It was a paradox I could feel in my chest, gratitude braided with a quiet, patient anger that had to do not with his choices, but with the reality those choices had been built on. The confession moved from recollection to explanation. He spoke of the physical things he'd stashed away, a cracked phone with the message, a receipt from the gas station, a cheap teddy I'd clutched it to. He showed me a small plastic sleeve, and inside, cold under the kitchen light, was the text message printed on a sheet of paper, the same 3 jagged words.
Seeing it there, black on white, made the past suddenly codified and incontrovertible. We needed that note, he said softly, not because it would bring you back or change the nights when things were hard, but because it gave us proof that someone had stepped away without asking. It let the truth sit where it could be seen. He ran a finger along the edge of the paper, like someone tracing the border of a map he'd navigated for years. He spoke of the value of facts when people try to rewrite memory. Paper can't bring back what was missing, he said. but it can stop people from telling a different story about who we were. There was a tenderness in the way he said it, like a man explaining how to protect a child from a version of the world that can be made cruel by other people's recollections. The admission that he'd kept things from me waited under the surface like an unturned stone. I wanted to ask why he'd chosen certain silences, which of the facts he thought would hurt me the most, whether he'd ever pictured a future where forgiveness would look different. I didn't ask those questions aloud. Instead, I felt them collect like rain in the gutter outside, quiet, inevitable, and waiting for direction. He pulled something else from his pocket then, an envelope, heavier than the paper inside might suggest. He didn't open it yet. For a moment, he held it like a relic. His hands trembled. It was not a show, but an honest reveal. He told me what it was, the letter of apology I'd only glimpsed when he mentioned a while back. It came much later, he said, long after the hospital, after the attempts to restart. It arrived folded and awkward, and it said things that were both true and inadequate. It apologized. It asked for forgiveness. It asked for permission to be part of your life again. My breath snagged. The letter was a hinge. In my mind, I staged scenes from the park meetings, the hesitant conversations, the stuffed animal left beside the bench, and tried to place this folded paper into that chronology. What was apology worth after years of absence? Could words written late on a page repair the nights of missed birthdays? These were the questions that lived in me, not answers. He did not ask me to forgive on the spot. He showed me the letter as his admission that pain had been caused, and as his explanation for why he had kept the envelope in that ring binder, not on the refrigerator as one might display triumph. The letter was a record, he said, not necessarily of redemption, but of attempt. It didn't undo anything, he told me, but it was a recognition. Sometimes recognition is the first step people take towards something that will look like change. Sometimes it is all you get. There was more he wanted to say, I could tell. His next sentences hummed with a weight I felt like an electric charge against my skin. He began to speak of why certain truths had been kept back beyond the pragmatic reasons, beyond courts and letters and receipts.
He tried to map the moral logic he'd followed, and in doing so, he exposed a fear I hadn't quite understood, the fear that knowledge could be used as a weapon. If I told you things too early, they could have become knives in someone else's hands, he said. Parents use children as bargaining chips more often than any of us like to admit. I saw how that could happen. I saw how your name could be used to hurt you or to hurt me. I kept that away. When he said, I saw, I wanted to press him for the images that made him see, but he was careful. He gave me enough to understand his boundary without throwing me into the churn of details that had made him so protective. He wanted me to know the shape of the danger without making me live in its center. There was a moment, small and private, where he reached across the counter and took my hand. It felt like a child's reassurance and an adult's pact at once. He looked at me and said, "You are not the reason people did what they did. You are not a thing to be traded." The clarity in his voice gave me a strange, unexpected steadiness. I had always known, somewhere deep, that I was loved. To hear that declared in a different grammar was grounding. He went on, and the kitchen filled with tasks and facts. He told me about the months when our identity was threatened, strange letters, calls that wanted our details. He described calling numbers at 2 a.m., cross-checking names, and how Patricia had helped to shut down attempts before they widened into something more dangerous. It became a test of endurance, he said, but we passed it because we kept records and because we had people who believed us. The list of people who believed them mattered because stories need witnesses. Linda, June, Patricia. These weren't grand characters, but they were steady presences in a story that could have splintered at any moment. Their small, mundane acts, showing up with soup, staying overnight, answering a lawyer's email, were the scaffolding that held our life together. He kept returning to the idea that a life is a sum of small, repeated graces, more than any single moment of salvation. He paused, and his eyes softened. "I never thought I would have to talk to you about this," he whispered, "but now you do, and you will decide what to do with it."
That promise, that choice, felt like a loaded gift. I had imagined many conversations over the years where I might ask him things, and he would dodge with a sidestep. This was not a sidestep. He had brought the map out and was pointing to the scars and the safe routes. He was offering me the knowledge that my childhood had been curated, not careless, that the absence I carried had been met with a particular kind of labor.
He breathed in slowly, then continued with an account I had only seen in fragments. The night the phone message had arrived, the days of forms and witness statements, the way Patricia sat across from us with a pen that made small marks on a sticky pad while I watched. He told me about the fear he had of making me repeat trauma, and about the precise moment he decided to hold certain facts back until I could hold them back too. As your guardian, I made calls I thought were right, he said. I cut off certain narratives before they could be told to you in a way that would have made you a victim instead of a person with dignity. There was so much in that sentence, so many debates about protection and autonomy compressed. At 18, I was old enough to wonder whether my dignity and the truth had ever been at odds. He seemed to suggest they had been, and that his hands had been forced by the dangers he'd seen. The question that spun quietly in my mind was this: when does protection become erasure? His answer, in essence, was that he judged between the lesser of two harms and chose to shield me. You were always more than what happened to you, he said, almost as a prayer, and I wanted the world to see that in the same way I did. He didn't end there. He reached into the envelope I'd seen and slowly drew a folded piece of paper toward the light. At the edge of its crease I could see handwriting, tentative and uneven. He told me its provenance without dramatics, who had written it, when it had been mailed, how long it had taken to arrive. He explained why he'd never read it aloud before, because letters like that can be bait for complicated feelings, and he had wanted me to approach them on my own terms. I felt my pulse quicken. The envelope was a hinge between the past and whatever future I might choose to build, between explanation and the task of deciding how to integrate these revelations into my life. He put the paper down on the counter between us, leaving it folded, and then he did something I hadn't expected. He asked me if I wanted to read it now. His question was a doorway. I stood there with my hand hovering over the paper, and in the space between the breath and my fingers, the kitchen held all its weight. Candle wax dried in a pool, the faint smear of frosting on the corner of the table, the dull hum of the refrigerator. The rain at the window felt like a memory made audible. Outside, the world washed itself with ordinary persistence. I hadn't finished heaving the small, private intake of breath when the front door clicked in the apartment's other rooms, a late neighbor returning, perhaps, or the sound of a car passing down the street. The life beyond the kitchen pressed at the walls. I knew I could unfold the letter right there and go through each awkward, raw line, but the story was not yet complete.
There were more things he had to say, about the exact boundaries he'd set when Vanessa tried to contact me later, about a particular document that had been key in the hearing, about how he had held on to hope in certain ways and set it down in others. He looked at me, and the light in his eyes was steady, waiting for me to decide whether to unseal the paper. The room felt like a hinge, like the place where a life's public facts meet its private meaning. I reached forward and touched the edge of the envelope, feeling the slight give of cheap paper, and I realized that this conversation, this confession, was the first time I'd been given the map whole, with no edits. The knowledge of that felt like ownership. But before my fingers closed over the envelope, he spoke one more thing, and it was the kind of sentence that would change the rest of the night. "There's one more thing," he said, "something I didn't put in the folder because I thought you needed to hear it from me before you read the rest." "There's one more thing," he said, and the kitchen, suddenly small and entire, tightened around those words. He set the envelope down gently, as if the paper might fray at the edges, and let loose something that had been sewn up for years. He told me then what he'd kept out of the binder, out of the public record, out of my afternoons and birthday cake conversations. It was not a new fact in the way a missing photograph might be new. It was the moral arrhythmia that had underwritten every choice he made afterward. He spoke slowly, tasting the syllables. "When she left at the gas station," he said, "it wasn't just that she walked away. It was that she walked away into certain people who wouldn't respect you. There was someone, Bradley,
who came after. I don't know everything about what they promised each other, indefinito on the reasons, but I know this. His presence made things more dangerous in a way I could see. People started calling. They started asking questions about access, about papers. I saw patterns. I saw how your name could be used. He didn't try to explain everything about other people's motives. He couldn't. He kept using that word, indefinito, when he reached the edges of what he could know with certainty. But the image was clear. A custody fight was not only against a person, but against whatever company and circumstances she had reinvented herself within. There were people who treated attachment as a bargaining chip. There were people who thought a child's life was something to manipulate. I had to imagine scenarios, he went on, and decide what would hurt you more. Would control by fear be worse than absence? Would being pulled between two versions of a parent, you and the versions they might sell you, leave you less intact than being with someone who would show up every morning? I don't pretend that's an easy calculus. I only tell you I ran the math.
He told me he'd run it and rerun it in the small hours when coffee had gone cold and the apartment light was the only proof that the world outside was still ordinary. He had thought often about whether silence was cowardice or sheltering. In the end, he'd chosen sheltering, frustrating and imperfect as it was, because he could not bear the thought of me being paraded as a tool to wound him or to score sympathy. That's why I kept some things out of the binder's public pages, he said, because sometimes the less a thing is spoken aloud, the less ammunition it becomes. He described, with a kind of careful geometry, the moment when he decided to move from keeping records to bringing them forward as proof. It wasn't a single dramatic night, so much as a sequence of small defeats and a few sharp threats, phone calls from unknown numbers that wanted information, a forged document that almost fooled a clerk, a man who claimed he could bring clarity if only we'd set a meeting. Each of those incidents stacked upon one another until the ledger of quiet records looked like armor instead of memory. It was Patricia who told me to make the folder administrative instead of vengeful, he said, and when he said her name, his voice warmed. She said, "Documents don't hate, and they don't plead, they show, so we let them show." He went on to describe the day they filed the motions with Patricia's help. The memory of the courthouse rose in his voice again, but this time there was a detail he hadn't given me before, the way the assistant's hand trembled when she stamped our papers, as if the machinery of bureaucracy itself felt the gravity. It was small, and it meant something. Official papers carry weight, precisely because they are not songs or promises, but things that can be read years from now and still say what happened. He said Vanessa had signed some of the divorce and custody paperwork. At some point she'd put pen to paper in a way that renounced certain rights. It was part of the legal chain, he told me. We couldn't have done what we did without those signed pages. They made a difference later in court. He paused then, listening as if the room might answer back. Judge Foster did what laws allow. She looked at the evidence we brought, and she asked hard questions. She didn't lecture. She just did her job. And one day, the papers came back with a stamp that made things administratively clear, the legal severing of parental rights. It didn't make the nights better, but it carved out a space to breathe. When he said it, when he named the outcome that had already existed in my memory like a bookmarked line, I felt the full weight of what had been done to protect me, and how he had carried that weight alone. It wasn't a triumphal story. There was no heroic music under his words.
There was only the relief of someone who had been given, by law and by the stubbornness of ordinary people, the right to decide what my childhood would look like without a predictable threat at its edges. And then he told me about Rachel. He didn't frame her as a replacement. He used words like steady, present, gentle, all lukewarm adjectives that became incandescent by the way he described them. Rachel was someone who showed up with a screwdriver and a casserole, he said. She didn't try to rewrite the past. She just fixed the sink and asked if I wanted an extra set of hands. Rachel's introduction into our life had been the kind of small, human entrance that rewrites a home's rhythm. She was the person who taught me to ride a bike behind the building courtyard when I was 8 and afraid, who packed a thermos of soup for long hospital nights, who showed up without announcement to sit in the back row of school plays because she wanted me to know someone was there who believed in me beyond the dozen ways the world measured me. My father explained that Rachel's presence did not cancel anything. It layered care on top of survival. She loved without asking for the past, he said. She loved because she chose to act like a mother would, and she did it without fanfare. He told me how Rachel helped him with paperwork when he was too exhausted to think. He told me about late-night dinners where they both fall asleep at the table because exhaustion makes its own intimacy, and about how Rachel never asked that I call her mom if it felt wrong. She simply kept showing up. "I wanted you to have more than me," he said quietly. "I wanted you to have a village and not feel like you were a job you'd been assigned." Hearing him speak about Rachel was a strange, tender thing. It felt like watching two halves of our life finally meet at the seam and not refuse each other. There were moments where his voice faltered, about the first time he introduced Rachel as his partner at a parent-teacher meeting, or how awkward it felt the first time she braided my hair because he'd always been the one who did it. But his gratitude toward her was a bright thread through the story he'd kept clutched. He also confessed at times when he had failed me. Those admissions were not performative. He told me how, for a while after the ruling, his anger sometimes spilled into the small daily spaces we shared. He remembered snapping about spilled cereal while harboring guilt about the abandoned childhood that had forced us into do-or-die parenting. "I thought silence was mercy, but sometimes it was cowardice," he admitted. "I let my bitterness make the rules of our house in private. I'm sorry for when that hurt you." When he said "I'm sorry" this time, I could feel the trace of those nights, the way he sometimes left for work without breakfast, the way he came home too tired to talk, the way I learned to soothe and to be soothed in the same hour.
The apology did not erase those moments, but it made them legible, and that legibility had its own kind of kindness. He took me back to the hospital visit, a memory that had always hovered at the edge of my awareness like an unlabeled photograph. He described how Vanessa had been admitted one winter night after a breakdown that the doctors would, indefinable, call something serious. He made sure to use clinical distance when he could, not to pathologize, but to locate the event in time. "She was there," he said. "It was a small episode in a larger life, but it made us see that her presence was inconsistent. That's why we kept you away that day. We thought you needed predictable safety more than you needed contact." He told me he'd gone to the hospital because certain formalities needed to be observed. Signatures had to be made. People had to be notified. He told me he had not gone because he wanted reconciliation. He went because life's mechanisms required witnesses, and because he hated the idea that anyone should be able to claim ignorance about what had happened. He told me he had sat in the waiting room and watched as other people came and went with normality intact, and he had felt both relief that I wasn't there and a grief at the loneliness such relief demands. "It's hard to explain how painful relief can feel," he said. "It was a strange combination, gratitude that you were safe, and grief for what had happened to you and to her." He told me about the letter, about how when it arrived he read it with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. It was an apology, he said, but a limited one. It acknowledged hurt and asked to start again in ways that made him wary. He left the letter in the binder because it was a record, an admission that something had occurred and that at least words had been offered in return. "Words aren't the same as change," he told me, "but they are part of the trail you can follow to see whether someone is moving toward different behavior." He told me he'd kept that letter accessible so that, if years later your path took you to that shelf, you could read it and decide what it meant to you. He wanted me to know that the letter's presence in the folder was not an invitation to reconciliation. It was evidence of accountability being attempted. Whether that attempt had value would have to be decided by me in my own time. When he spoke of the fraud attempts, of Richard Delroy and the nights where phony documents and shadow calls tested our defenses, his voice hardened. The crime was procedural and low, but it felt intimate. Someone tried to manufacture access. Someone else tried to make our story a key to a financial or bureaucratic advantage. He described the sensation of someone's hand feeling for a loose seam in a coat, the discomfort of being exposed. "We protected you," he said simply. "We wouldn't let your name be used. Patricia helped close those doors." He told me he had spent time on the phone, calling agencies, confirming things that must be confirmed. He had sat in small rooms with people who read off lists of names and dates and had felt a kind of exhausted rage at how much paperwork it took to preserve an ordinary life. He said that sometimes he felt like Sisyphus, pushing a rock of invoices and reports uphill, only to have new complications roll back down. But in the end, the rock stayed where it needed to be. The systems we built,
kept us from being taken apart. The confession turned inward as he admitted the cost of that vigilance. He talked about the nights he'd fallen asleep over a lamplit ledger and the dreams that had become audits. He discussed the quiet erosion of his own straightforwardness into a kind of hypervigilance that sometimes made him harsh, even toward the people who loved him, Rachel included. He told me he regretted that his fear sometimes looked like coldness. "I wanted to be brave for you," he said. "I wanted to be the kind of person who could stand against whatever came. But bravery can calcify into a hardness that makes everyone around you brittle. I tried to soften when I could. I failed sometimes." That admission about failure, about the strain of trying to be sufficient, felt like the hinge of the confession. He was not telling me to admire his endurance. He was asking me to understand the architecture of his choices, a scaffolding made partly of courage and partly of fear, bound together by the daily work of showing up. There was a silence then that was not awkward, but charged. I could hear the rain thinning against the window. The candle wax had hardened. The envelope with the apology letter lay folded, unexamined. For a moment I imagined all the rooms in my life as small courtrooms in which the facts were assembled and weighed, and the judge was some private tribunal inside me. He put his hand over mine and squeezed it in a way that said more than any of the legal documents. "I kept things back because I believed you had a right to a life unmilked for evidence," he said. "I kept things back because telling everything to you at age 6 would have used you. I kept things back because some truths become weapons in other people's mouths. I am sorry for the ways my silence hurt you. I also think the silence kept you whole enough to make your own choices when you were ready." I thought about my 6-year-old self, and my 8-year-old self, and my 13-year-old self, and how each of them had carried questions that I let go of like stones into a pond, waiting to see what ripples returned. The confession did not give me a tidy moral. It gave me an outline of a life that had been deliberately guarded, not hidden for selfishness, but folded to protect. It felt like someone handing me the map and saying, "You can travel anywhere from here." It was the moment he explained what that map might allow me to choose that became the real turning point.
"You can forgive," he said, "or you can keep distance. You can write a letter back, or you can put this all into storage and move forward. All of those are legitimate. I didn't want you to feel coerced into forgiveness. That's not forgiveness. That's consent under pressure." I remember being angry that he had delayed this conversation, that he'd held so many decisions in his own hands, but the anger had a learning edge to it. He had protected my agency in the only way he could conceive, by making sure I reached the age when I could decide without being manipulated. His choice to wait until I was 18, legally an adult, felt calculated, but also tender. He said so. "I wanted you to be able to pick up and drop the past on your terms." We talked then, not in the careful monologue of confessions, but in a stranger's choreography, where he would say something and I would reply, and then he would answer. He asked me things. He asked how I felt about the letter. He asked whether I wanted him to put the binder away again. He asked whether I wanted him to continue to manage the legal things that remained, like the occasional letter or the weird phone call. "I don't need you to be my lawyer," I said at some point, with an honesty that surprised me. "I need you to be my father, but I also don't want you to carry all my decisions for me." He smiled in a way that looked like gratitude. "That's fair," he said. "I want to keep being your father, not your overlord." We laughed then, awkward, small, and it broke something between us that had hardened into a pattern. It wasn't resolution, it was movement. When I finally asked if I could open the letter, he nodded and pushed it toward me. My hands shook. I unfolded it with the reverence of someone who knows an artifact is only paper, but feels the past inside the fibers anyway. The handwriting had that tilt people use when they think they are being sincere. The words were apologetic, threadbare in places and earnest in others. There were admissions that something had gone wrong, requests for understanding, clumsy pleas for a second chance. There were lines that made me want to cry, and lines that made me want to tear the paper into confetti. I read it alone at the counter, and he watched me with that same expression he'd had when he'd said the word indefinito, a man holding his breath, hoping I wouldn't be burned by the truth. When I finished, I folded the letter back along its crease and placed it quietly into the envelope. "I don't think it's enough for me to decide forgiveness tonight," I said, "but I'm glad it exists." "Me too," he said, "and if you need more time than me, for this and for any conversation about her, you take it."
That permission to not rush my feelings felt like the final gift of the night. It was not dramatic. It was not cinematic. It was ordinary and exactly what I needed, the right to be an agent in my own life. The confession also brought with it a practical current.
He told me he'd kept the binder because there were still loose threads, administrative things that needed tending. There were also people who had helped and who would continue to help. Linda, who still lived a few blocks away and made sure our apartment never lacked soup when the city was cruel. June, who had always been a modestly luminous presence. Patricia, who was pragmatic and efficient and available when paperwork demanded it. He said he would continue to answer lawyerly emails if I wanted him to, but that if I wanted a say in what was done, he would listen. "Your voice matters now in ways I tried to keep it safe for," he said. "How do you want to use it? What do you want the story we keep to be?" I thought about all the things I had feared would define me. A child of absence, a footnote in someone else's tale. The confession reframed it into something else entirely, an ongoing story of people who showed up. The mother who left was part of the story, but she was no longer the author. My life, he suggested, could be written in the ink of daily presence, the nights that he and Rachel and Linda and June and Patricia had come through. "You were always the person I wanted to be there for," he said. "All the rest was extra." It struck me then how small a thing a phrase can be when it is finally said aloud. For years I had carried the idea, almost like a superstition, that the truth might free me in some big way. Instead, the truth freed me incrementally, in shifts and in the permission to make little choices. The conversation ended not with a dramatic reconciliation, but with a quiet logistics plan. He promised to leave the binder where it was, but listed things he would remove from his solo control: the passwords to accounts he had set up for my schooling, the contact information for people who had been witnesses, the way he would notify me if there were any new attempts to reach or exploit our identity. "You will always be you," he said. "The papers only show what happened. They don't make the person you are. You'll be the sum of the loving things people kept bringing you." The kitchen light was growing dimmer by then, and the rest of the apartment had sunk to the usual evening hush. I felt older in the practical, ordinary way that 18 can make you feel, the feeling of standing at a threshold with a small bundle of keys in your pocket. The confession had not fixed everything, but it had given me not only information, but also agency, the right to choose what to do with it. I went to bed that night with the letter folded beside the alarm clock. Sleep came in shallow stages, as it always had when my brain needed time to assemble a new map. In the morning, the world was encouragingly uncomplicated. The subway hummed, a barista forgot my name and called me friend, and someone in the building played music like a neighborly benediction. Life, I realized, continues in ordinary ways, even after significant confessions. Months later, the conversation would shape decisions I made for myself. When I left for college, I felt a steadier ballast. The knowledge of the binder was a strange comfort, like having an atlas on a wall you might never read but could see if you got lost. When the occasional letter or odd call came, I no longer imagined I had to shoulder the response alone. I knew the supporting characters existed, with names and emails and a practiced way of stepping in. My relationship with my father shifted too. There were fewer secrets, though not because everything was forcibly laid bare, but because the most consequential pieces had been spoken. We fought less about the past because there was less unspoken rubble for arguments to fall on. We fought more about ordinary things, coffee brands, whether the apartment needed curtains, but the fights felt less like detonations and more like the friction of two people who had chosen to keep caring for each other. I learned how to hold boundaries. When Vanessa tried to text again, some months after my birthday, a short tentative message asking how I was, I paused. I texted my father, and we discussed whether a reply might be warranted or whether silence was the better guard. We talked through possible responses, with the practical clarity of two people who had read the same binder. I chose not to respond. The refusal was not cruelty, it was self-preservation. It was one of the first decisions I made with the map he gave me. My gratitude for my father did not arrive as simple adoration. It came braided with the complexity of what he had withheld, and with the knowledge that he'd acted out of protective intention. I forgave him in pieces, sometimes for small things, sometimes for larger omissions, and sometimes I held my silence as a way of practicing the very autonomy he had tried so carefully to defend. People asked me afterward whether the confession had changed how I saw my mother. It had, but not in linear terms.
I stopped seeing her solely as the act of leaving and started seeing her as a person who had been part of a complex web of choices I did not have to untangle alone. The letter did not warrant immediate affection. It warranted recognition that a human had acknowledged pain. Whether that acknowledgement would lead to meaningful change was, and remains, for me to decide. What the confession did definitively alter was my sense of ownership over my story. For years, I had felt as if my life's narrative had been written in someone else's ink. Hearing him, my father, articulate what he had done and why gave me a pen. I could annotate, redact, or append. My sense of self had room now to be authored by me. On that night, with the candle stub and the rain and the envelope between us, I learned a new language of adulthood, that truth is not always instantaneous catharsis, but often a slow accretion of permission and clarity.
I understood that protecting someone sometimes requires secrecy, and that secrecy can be both protective and complicated. I learned that chosen family, Rachel, Linda, June, Patricia, could make a life as real as any genetic tie. Years later, when I think back to that kitchen and to the way his hands trembled as he held the envelope, I don't think about blame. I think about the quieter thing he taught me, without intending to teach it. Love is the practice of showing up, day after day, in ways that are both mundane and brave. On my 18th birthday, I expected cake. I did not expect instructions for how to be an adult, but I got them all the same. Some given as confession, some given as concrete tools. He gave me facts, and he gave me argument. He gave me the binder, and he gave me the right to decide what to do with it. He offered me the narrative, and in doing so, he offered me the permission to own mine. As I blew out the last candle that night, I made a wish that was less about magic and more about steadiness, that I would learn to show up for others the way he and the tiny constellation of people around us had shown up for me. The confession shifted the coordinates of my life, not because it healed the past, but because it handed me a map and told me I could choose a road. If this story moved you, like and subscribe for more true life stories about family and resilience.